State versus Jacques D. Tordeau, aka Ziggy Starlight, in the manner of finding of fact, ruling of law and order of defendant's motions to suppress photo lineup, Miranda, nude photos, and 2 separate trials. Motions eliminate in regards to FRE Rule 404B little 2, same or similar act, and to exclude for rape shield. This is my introduction. The defense motioned to suppress the results of the photo lineup because of how it was conducted and to suppress their client's confession because he was not read his Miranda rights. They also moved to have a testimony that is brought up under the belief that it is a same or similar act to be dismissed. The prosecution argues that the photo lineup and the confession should not be thrown out because they are carried out correctly, and they moved to suppress the lab results under the guise of rape shield. Finding of fact. Based on the evidence that was provided to the court, can find the following facts. On May 22, 2012, Mr. Thorax arrived at the Southern Muncie Police Station of his own free will to talk. During this interview, he claimed that he was outside his residence and the victim stopped by. While they were there, Mr. Thorax said to them and invited them into his residence, and they followed him in. He then went on to claim that they spent some time in his living room and they took turns sitting on his lap and hugging him. Mr. Thorax then said that they went up to his room where they proceeded to listen to music and lay down next to him on his bed, and the victims in this case cuddled with him. Then the victims, according to Mr. Thorax, got into a verbal dispute over who was going to be with him. There is no record to if Mr. Thorax was read his Miranda rights before he carried out this interview with the police. On May 23, 2012, the 2 victims were shown a single photo together while they were on school grounds. They were asked if this was the individual who carried out the act, with one victim saying yes and the other replying that she was 100% sure that it was him. In regards to the ruling of law, first the photo lineup. When it comes to the photo lineup, there are 2 main reasons that has an impact on the court's ruling. The first is that both victims were together when they were shown this photo lineup. With both victims seeing this photo, there is a higher chance of suggestibility. This is because when one victim identifies a suspect, the other victim sees this and they are more likely to confirm what the other says, leading to a higher chance of misidentification. While the Supreme Court in Simmons versus the United States say that the practice of showing a group of victims the same photo lineup together is okay, they also made a point to state that it is preferred that the victims be separated during this action. Since both victims were together in a public area, this might have played a role in the victims identifying the defendant, Jacques D. Tordeau, aka Ziggy Starlight. The second factor that played a part in the ruling that the photo lineup is admissible in this case is that it is only made up of one photo. With only one photo making up this lineup, how can one really call it a lineup? To call it a lineup, it must have multiple photos of individuals who look like the suspect. That way the victims are able to look at a different individual and lessen the chance of suggestibility. This was not carried out in this case. Instead, what happened was that they were only shown one photo of the defendant, which increases suggestibility because they're only shown this one photo to identify him if this suspect was the one who sexually assaulted them. Same or similar act. In this case, Liz is of a different age, over the age of 18, compared to the victims who are underage. With the difference in age, it would confuse the jury in how this victim is tied to this case in particular. It must also be brought to attention that this testimony will be more prejudicial than probative. This is because with the topics that are being brought up and how it will be framed, it will make the defendant sound like he's already guilty of one act of sexual assault. What is to say that he did not do the same for these 2 victims? Miranda. There are 4 important reasons that played a role in this ruling. The first is that the defendant walked into the police department voluntarily and agreed to talk to the police officers about this crime. It was at this moment that he waived his 5th Amendment rights in regards to lawyer and self-incrimination because he agreed to talk to the police officers. The second reason why the court is ruling in this way is because the defendant walked to the police officers with his own free will, which leads to the brain of thought that he believed that he could talk about whatever he wanted. Thus, the interrogation cannot be viewed as coercive because the defendant talked freely about what actions he carried out during the commission of this said crime. At any point, he could have walked out and left when he felt uncomfortable, but did not. Thus, this confession was given when he waived his 5th Amendment rights and was not coerced in any way to confess to this crime. The 2 other reasons that are important when it comes to decision is that if he must be read his Miranda rights. When an officer is required to read an individual their Miranda rights, they must be in custody and be interrogated. At this point, from what the court can determine is the fact that when the defendant walked into the apartment, the officers only knew his name and wanted to talk to him. At this point, he was not a suspect, and there were not any arrest warrants out for his arrest related to this case. At this point, he was not in custody, and he was able to leave when he wished. When the defense raises the point that the defendant was not allowed to see his mother, there is no evidence presented in the documents that I have seen to show this. What is present is that interrogation took place with the officers asking him specific questions that dealt with the case and having the defendant answer these questions. While one point is met, the interrogation, he was not in custody at this point. Thus, the interview that was conducted is allowed. Rape shield. Two factors played a role in this decision. The first one being that the Federal Rules of Evidence 412 goes over the fact that the victim's previous sexual behavior cannot be brought up in trial. This is because this is a form of victim blaming / victim shaming in which the victim is painted in a bad light because of her sexual history, which does not have a part in this case. The other factor that played a role in this ruling is that the victim stated that the defendant used a condom when he carried out the assault, and the lab results had no DNA evidence that was tied to the defendant. Thus, the court does not see a need to introduce this evidence. In regards to the nude photos, there are two important factors that come into play when it comes to the court's ruling regarding these nude photos. The first being is that the victims in this case were unable to identify themselves in these photos that were taken during a sexual act. If the jury is shown random photos in such a state, it would end up making the jury more hostile towards the defendant. This leads to a second point in for which these photos would be more prejudicial than probative. This is because of the time they were taken, what is happening in the photo, the jury would become more hostile towards the defendant and would not allow him to have a fair trial. Two separate trials. There is one factor that affected the way in which the court ruled, the prejudicial effect over probative value. In this case, if the defendant was placed on trial for the crimes that he is charged with, if he is convicted of one count, it could influence the jury to find him guilty of another charge because he must have committed the other crime. It is important to ensure that the defendant is given a fair trial. The orders. Photo lineup. The ruling of this court is that the photo lineup is inadmissible because it violates the due process doctrine because of its suggestibility. Same or similar act. The ruling of this court is that the same or similar act that is presented by testimony provided by the previous victim by the name of Liz is inadmissible. Miranda. The ruling of this court is that the confession is admissible because it is not a violation of the defendant's Fifth Amendment rights. Rape shield. The ruling of this court is the lab results are inadmissible because they are a violation of FRE Rule 412. Nude photos. The ruling of the court is that nude photos are inadmissible because the victims are not able to identify themselves in these photos and because showing these photos of underage females to the jury would be more prejudicial than probative. Two separate trials. The ruling of the court is that having two separate trials is admissible because the two victims were tied together and be more prejudicial than probative. We're good.